Hello, everybody. Welcome to Terrace View, the Wisconsin Badgers podcast from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. My name is J.R. Radcliffe. I am joined in the house by my colleagues at the Journal Sentinel, Mark Stewart and John Steppe, both covering Wisconsin athletics. And it has been, once again, a busy stretch here, but particularly the last couple days with the opening of the football transfer portal. Now, I related this on another podcast to like playing a board game and someone just like gets mad and throws the board into the air and all the pieces land in different places and it's just complete chaos and there's no way to, I don't think, make sense of where everything lands and what types of players the Badgers are bringing in to this point. By the time you hear this, I'm sure they will have 3 or 4 more new names in the portal. Mark has been furiously writing for jsonline.com every time somebody new steps into the light here. But Mark, I want to start with the obvious place, and that's at quarterback. You know, that was going to be an offseason priority. We know Billy Edwards is portaling out. It sounds like he's going to end up at North Carolina. And they got Colton Joseph from Old Dominion, a high-achieving quarterback, certainly. Now, that's in the Sun Belt. Super intriguing, and probably one of the top 20 quarterbacks that were available in the portal thus far. So that's a promising first start. And before we get to everybody else, I just want to know what people should be thinking about this guy here, what you think it says about the future of the Badgers in terms of an offense. Like, what are the takeaways here now that they do have a guy who will presumably be the starting quarterback next year and maybe even the year after that? He's got a couple of years of eligibility remaining.
Yeah, a couple of things I thought. One, the guy, there was a lot of talk this year about, style of play and, how Wisconsin had to kind of, change his style of play after Billy Edwards got injured. And I think, adding Colton Joseph, brings in a quarterback that has the same type of skills as a Carter Smith and a Danny O'Neal, who, as we're speaking, are on track to be back next year. And I think that was a big problem last year. So I think that it's good from that standpoint. And I like the fact that, as a dual threat quarterback, Wisconsin their offense doesn't necessarily need a guy who's going to be a stud thrower. You almost, with all due respect to Wisconsin quarterbacks, I almost picture Wisconsin's ideal quarterback as a guy who kind of wins ugly. Maybe he's running the ball sometime, maybe he's throwing it sometimes. And I think Colton Joseph is the kind of guy that can kind of fit that mold. I will say at this time of year, for fans, it's, every pass this guy throws is going to seem like it's a tight spiral, and every run he makes is going to, seem like he's just super fast. And then, when you start seeing him play every play, obviously he's not going to be a perfect player, and he's making a significant jump to the Big Ten. But, I like the concept of him. I like a guy that, you don't necessarily, that he can run the ball, he can throw the ball some. I think we saw some of that success, with Danny O'Neal and Carter Smith to a certain extent too, with them as runners. And how that really is kind of tough for defenses to slow down. So it's a very intriguing prospect, and I think it might be a better fit than Billy Edwards would have been for the offense.
I think, Mark, that for one thing, he has to stay healthy, which has not been the case the last 3 years, and for another, I think it's with Fernando Mendoza doing what he's doing for Indiana. Now, Indiana obviously had success last year before Mendoza got to Indiana. But the fact that they're on the cusp of a national championship game, there's a lot of just eagerness for, all you need is the right quarterback, and maybe you can take a big step forward. Now, nobody, I think, believes Wisconsin is going to launch themselves from a 4-win team to a CFP team overnight just because of a quarterback. But there's, I think, a curiosity. Can a quarterback just take you from really being a really bad team to being a competent team overnight? Is that something that Badgers fans should expect? That's a lot to put on one guy. And again, you're talking about somebody from the Sun Belt. I don't think we have any inkling that could be the case. But is that something that the Badgers could be building toward? Like, do they think they can do this in 1 year's time through the transfer portal? Or, and that's maybe why you get a guy with multiple years of eligibility remaining, is this like a 2-year plan, a 3-year plan? Can you even have a 2-year or 3-year plan in the current age of the transfer portal where all the pieces get, moved around every year?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that, you don't want to call it the curse of Indiana, but ever since, Indiana's made this phenomenal flip, and it still even blows my mind that where Indiana was, just 2 years ago. Who would have thought they would be doing what they're doing 2 years ago? It's created this super expectation that, hey, you can flip a team in a year or two, and you can greatly change a team, just given, adding 20 or 20 plus players, which I think probably Wisconsin's going to be in that range of adding 20 plus players that you hope are going to be impact players. But a lot's got to go right. The quarterback gets a lot of credit, and there's a lot of heaped on their shoulders, and they can make a huge difference. But you still got to have an offensive line. I mean, we've seen that too. Offensive line struggles were key for Wisconsin. And you look at Indiana, and they have a really good offensive line. So there are a lot of pieces that have to come into place. And I mean, I think Indiana's created this huge expectation that, oh, hey, if Indiana can do it, heck, Wisconsin can. It's and I don't think it's going to be that easy. I mean, the Big Ten's rugged. Everyone's spending more. I think that's the catchphrase. It's like, if Wisconsin, you think you're spending more, well, then all of a sudden the people at Ohio State are like, oh, we didn't know you needed that much. Well, let's just give you 10 million more.
Right.
So it's going to be interesting, like, trying to keep up with the halves in college football right now for a program like Wisconsin is going to be challenging. And, to go back to your question, don't put too much. I mean, it's great that they got the quarterback they wanted, but I think they're going to need more to that than, just having the right guy in place at that position to, start climbing in the Big Ten.
What you're describing reminds me of the Brewers situation where they lost to Yoshinobu Yamamoto of the Dodgers. And, the thought being, well, what if the Brewers had jumped in with a offer, a package that he signed with the Dodgers? And I always say, well, if they had done that, he wouldn't be a Brewer. He would just be a Dodger making more money because they would have countered. That is, I'm sure, something that Badgers are running into. And as I think about the offensive line, that Indiana offensive line is great. They've got Drew Evans, former Wisconsin recruit, a guy who didn't see the field as a freshman, understandably, what offensive line, not many offensive linemen do as a true freshman. And it feels like that's a position anecdotally that requires, building, building that camaraderie, not camaraderie, but the chemistry, your skills, your strength, all of that develops over the course of 4 years. And if you can't keep a guy for 4 years, how are you going to have quality offensive linemen? Those guys quite often in Wisconsin history are guys who waited a year behind, bigger, older guys and then developed into what they ultimately became. John, I want your thoughts on Colton Joseph, but also the transfer portal at large, the guys that they've brought in, if any names really trigger. I mean, some of these names, like, we can try to be excited about them, but they're not like even on the too deep of their previous team. So like, I no idea what to expect there. But what are some of your takeaways thus far?
Yeah, Joseph obviously at quarterback, Sama at running back. Those were two additions that I thought really caught my eye. Sama obviously has done some fantastic things at Iowa State. Came from Southeast Polk, which is a football factory, it feels like. Caden Proctor, the Alabama offensive tackle, came from there. So you look at it, those two really stood out to me. Obviously, a lot of other great players in this class. But I would say overall, this is kind of what you wanted to see. I think everyone was worried as they're losing all those guys, and the retention side of things wasn't necessarily going to plan. And after you lose some key guys, after you lose Nellegro, kind of go down the list, they needed to bring in some, names that could impress. And I think they have brought in some names that could impress. The key thing, though, is kind of with all of these guys, it's a roll of the dice in terms of, okay, how does Sun Belt results translate to Big Ten results? That's a question mark. Even when you're looking at somebody who has proven Big Ten experience, that doesn't necessarily always translate. Obviously, we never know what would have happened with Billy Edwards if he was actually healthy for a season. But, to use Wisconsin's neighbor to the southwest as an example, Iowa fans got all excited about having Cade McNamara, and look how that turned out for them. So, all of these, you don't necessarily know, how good the fit is going to be. And after, a 5-win season 2 years ago, a 4-win season this past season, I kind of need to see it before I believe it. As great as Abu Sama is at running back, what's this offensive line looking like? And, Wisconsin needs to be in a spot where they can develop really great offensive linemen. And that's harder to do when that offensive line coach position has been a little bit of a revolving door. Luke Fickell is going into his 4th season and has his 3rd offensive line coach. So I think there's certainly a lot of question marks, certainly some reasons. The half glass full person has plenty of reason to be having that half glass full. But also I think there's probably still some healthy skepticism, not projecting any banners necessarily, for 2026 at this point. So yeah, it'll be an interesting next, rest of the portal cycle, and really interesting August in Platteville.
Sama running at Iowa State. Dylan Barrett, another former Badgers offensive lineman who's had some success at the Division I level. If only they'd kept those guys, maybe they'd be in better shape. John, you mentioned retention. I want to hear a little bit more about that. Guys who have left since we last chatted, there are many. Dylan Jones among them. I am in a position here as I look at this program. Can't say I get too wound up over any departures. Feels like whatever they had wasn't working. Why should I think some of these pieces will or won't work? I have no idea. Tucker Ashcraft has entered the portal since we last chatted. Are there guys that you really circle that you say to yourself, I mean, Wisconsin having its druthers would have absolutely brought that guy back, and the fact that they aren't is maybe something they weren't anticipating or could be considered a setback?
I think Allegro is the first one that comes to mind in terms of a guy that you really would have liked to have that they didn't. Dylan Jones, that obviously is a substantial loss there at running back. That feels better now, that Sama is coming in. But Jones had a lot of potential there at that position. Wide receiver is a hard position to retain when you don't have offensive results. That's a hard enough position to retain when you do have an effective passing game, because the ball can only go one way per play. And, I would venture to say you're probably not going to find too many wide receivers who think that they're getting too many targets. I'm sure plenty of wide receivers out there think they're getting too few targets. So, to lose somebody like Eugene Hilton, to lose Tresh Kekahuna, they lost a lot of guys in terms of skill positions on offense. Jake Renfro, that kind of goes into this, you're not necessarily getting a ton of stability with that offensive line with those departures. It's interesting with like Billy Edwards at quarterback, or Preston Zachman. Those are guys that you weren't necessarily expect. Like if we were having this conversation a year ago, that isn't necessarily somebody you were expecting to be an option in 2026. Obviously with their injuries, that changes things. So, I don't necessarily count that as much of a loss when it's something that you weren't necessarily expecting to have. But, for Preston Zachman to be helping a different Big Ten team with the experience that he has, that one maybe will sting a little bit. So, they still have some more work to do in the portal, especially after, you lose all those guys that I mentioned.
Yeah, well, there'll be, like I said, there'll be names fast and furious. We don't even know the half of it of guys who will be coming to Wisconsin over the next few weeks. Mark, I want to give you a chance to, besides Colton Joseph, any other guys that really jump out at you, or any takeaways that you have fashioned, having seen some of the names that have come in. I'll be honest, I don't even know all the names offhand. Like I followed some of it, and then very, very quickly my eyes started glossing over. It's like, put them on the list. I have no idea what to expect. Guy from my alma mater, Kaukauna, though, I'm happy to see that another Kaukanian joining Gavin Lamb as recent Wisconsin Badgers. But what do you think, Mark? Anything jump out at you?
A couple of things. Going to Carson Van Denter.
That's my guy.
The guy from Kaukauna. There's a lot of Luke Fickell and his staff have gotten criticized for not recruiting the state. And I think, in this portal market, sort of the secondary market of bringing guys back is where you might see more Wisconsin guys coming back to the state because, let's be honest. I mean, I love Wisconsin high school football, but, there might be other states that have stronger, more deeper pockets of players. So when it comes to recruiting high school guys from here versus other places, sometimes, your college program might go elsewhere. But, we've seen it with some of these guys they brought back these last couple of years that, you can, get that Wisconsin flavor to your team. It just might come in a different way. Jump into what John said. I do think the one guy I was thinking that they would really miss, or maybe I was just hoping to see him play, was Preston Zachman, because I thought he was on track to really have a really good year this year. And, for him to only play 3 games because of that, that leg injury. And then, now he's going to Indiana. And I can't remember. Is Indiana's not on the schedule next year? I don't think, John. I know.
I was just thinking about what they're. I don't think so. They do have a more favorable draw. As you continue answering that, I'll pull this up in my notes.
Yeah.
To see.
But yeah, so Preston Zachman was a guy that I thought like, okay, that would have been a guy that I would have liked to have seen what he could do as a healthy player. And the one guy when you talk about intriguing prospects that they picked up so far, there's this guy from Arkansas named Justice Boone, who he started his career at Florida, then he played at Arkansas last year, and now he's coming to Wisconsin. And he's an outside linebacker, edge rusher. He's a guy that 2 years ago hurt his knee towards ACL, and then he came back. No, 3 years ago. So he came back in 2024 at Florida, 2025 at Arkansas. And, this is going to be his 3rd year back from that injury. So I wonder, can Wisconsin be, pick up a guy that's kind of on the rise? You talked about the Brewers, JR, and I think that's kind of how, Wisconsin and a lot of these programs are. You're going to have to get these guys, buy low, so to speak. And then at some point, if, you get a guy who's got 2-3 years eligibility left, he might, grow out of your price range, and you might have to let him go to, the quote unquote big market team. But Justice Boone, when you talk about who stands out, who intrigues me, Justice Boone, the outside linebacker from Arkansas, is a guy I'm interested to see how he looks once he gets here.
I love that name, Justice Boone. Sounds like an awesome edge rusher just on name alone. So can't wait to see that. I do love it when they bring in guys from this state, purely because I have a background in prep sports like you, Mark. So I enjoy that, and I also think now with the team and with the program in the down cycle, you're gonna need guys who still have an attachment to the Wisconsin football to help build this up. But I also feel like that was it's such an anachronism to talk about recruiting the state, because that was when you could develop guys. You'd get guys, buy low is the wrong way to put it in my mind, but get guys on the ground level, build them up into studs because they want to be here. They want to stay at Wisconsin. There's just nobody like that. That's just not how it works anymore. So, I see what you're saying. Like maybe the Wisconsinites are the kids who go elsewhere, try to find their, try to find their fortune and fame elsewhere, and then come home and see if they can maybe take it a step further. John, let's pivot. Let's talk about men's basketball. They played Purdue over the weekend. It did not go well. Purdue's very good. They're one of the best teams in the country. Wisconsin was largely uncompetitive. If we're being honest, I mean, they held it together there. Good first half. Fell apart after that. They just cannot defend a team like Purdue. And we've seen a couple uncompetitive games against some high-level teams. Nebraska was not familiar with your game. Hello, Nebraska. You look very, very good at this point. So, suffering a big-time beatdown on the road in Nebraska is really not much shame at this point. They're going to go play Michigan. That's another, maybe the best team in the country, probably the best team in the country. That's going to be tough. Is this a tournament team? Can you look at this team and see how this gets put together, how they win just enough to get into the NCAA tournament? Because it's looking, maybe not from my perspective, it doesn't look good from where I'm sitting. Maybe there are some components in there that can come together. I don't know, John. Talk me off the ledge on this one.
Well, my first thought is probably not necessarily going to talk you off the ledge. Are you going to push me? You're going to push me off the ledge, John? Look at how I am. This is dangerous. I will keep you safely in that 5th floor. window.
Okay. All right.
But I would say right now they have work to do before you can really consider them to be a tournament team. You look at it and, all the national prognostications have Wisconsin very much on the outside looking in. And, I think last night they were 63rd in net. They still don't have a quad one win. And perhaps the most concerning thing is just how uncompetitive a lot of those quad one losses have been. Purdue, that was a competitive first half. You wonder what would have happened if John Blackwell didn't get in foul trouble. The biggest what if the defense doesn't just totally collapse there from about the 16:30 to 12:30 mark in the second half. That was really when things unraveled for them. And, it was a spirited run at the end there to make that look closer than it probably was. But you just can't win quad one games. You can't beat teams of a Purdue caliber or of a NCAA tournament caliber when you have that bad of a stretch for, even just 4 minutes where, 19 points given up in 4 minutes. Somebody can do the math faster than me on that. But, if that continued over the course of a game, that would be quite problematic there. So, it's a team with some inconsistencies that it's been a consistent problem in terms of how inconsistent this team has been. And, the 3-point shooting hasn't been great in the last couple of games, but really the defensive inconsistencies is probably what gives me the most pause. Not that the offense has been spectacular. The defense has been the popular thing to kind of, critique this season. The offense has issues too. I think, when some of the things were going right for Wisconsin in the first half against Purdue, they also had a lot of self-inflicted wounds there that really held them back. And you look at it, and at this point, it's, I was saying this in my post-game walk and talk too, that, I hesitate to say anything is a must win in January. There is still another 2+ months before Selection Sunday, but this UCLA game is one that Wisconsin is really going to want to have. And the tournament resume needs a lot of work. And, if you're looking for the kind of my long way to the, what you were asking about talking off a ledge, you do see the potential of, okay, if such and such, such and such, and such and such go right, if John Blackwell plays, at an elevated level, what we saw in some of those earlier games, what we saw against Marquette, for example, and Shaka Smart had some high praise for Blackwell after that one. That could put this team in a tournament conversation. If you get more out of Austin Rapp, a transfer that I think had a lot of hype, the West Coast Conference Freshman of the Year, he's had a challenging first few months of the season. If you can get more out of him, maybe that puts you in that tournament conversation. If this defense improves dramatically, okay, that would put you in that tournament conversation. But those are ifs. And right now, this does not look like a tournament team at this point in the year.
Mark Stewart, do we dare dream of a world, a improbable world, where the men's basketball team doesn't make the NCAA tournament, but the women's basketball team does make the NCAA tournament? That has not happened since 2010. We're getting ready for the Packers-Bears playoff game. Last time they met in a playoff game, 2010. So it's been an era or so since the women's team has been in there. They are 11-4. They just had a really nice win over Penn State. I don't think they're a playoff team yet, or I should say a tournament team yet. That's still a long way to go. But give me your thoughts on where they stand. This is an uncommon place to be. Things are working out here under first-year coach Robin Pingeton.
Yeah, and I can say don't hold me to this, but John was talking about quad one wins. I think the Wisconsin women have won.
There we go.
They beat Michigan State.
That's right. Crazy.
So like you say, in this weird world, who would have thought that? Okay, the women would have more quad wins than the men at this point. definitely a long way to go. I mean, I think the thing you gotta like about what the Wisconsin women are doing right now is the Big Ten is so tough that you can't just lose to teams that you shouldn't lose to. And I think that was one of the challenges with this team in the past is that they would face teams like, struggling teams like Penn State or Northwestern or Rutgers, and sometimes they wouldn't win. And they're in the stretch of the season now where they've got those teams on the schedule. They just played Penn State. They played Rutgers on Saturday, I think. They got Purdue on Thursday. These are games they got to win, and then build up some momentum, and maybe you get a chance to knock off a team. I mean, it's definitely a long way from the NCAA tournament, but there's so many tournaments in women's college basketball. There are at least 3 of them that I definitely think they're on the track to get there. Maybe, they don't call it the NIT anymore, but
they got the WBIT and I think the WNIT. Am I remembering right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The WNIT is the 3rd tier, and the WBIT is the 2nd tier tournament. So I mean, I think Coach Robin Pinkston's goal was to be a postseason team. She didn't say where or how, and I think they definitely are fitting into maybe that middle mold right now. I think it's great what they're doing so far. I do think there might be there are going to be some challenging days ahead in the Big Ten. Like I say, with Michigan's tough, UCLA, USC is a little down, but they're still going to be tough for Wisconsin. Illinois is playing well. There are a lot of strong teams they have to get through before we can, fully say, hey, hold out for Selection Sunday, and they're going to be doing some stuff. But they're on a nice run, and they're showing some nice progress for a team that's struggled for so long.
Let's stay in the women's sports realm and go back into a fall season sport with volleyball. The last time we talked, the Badgers were making a surprise run to the Final Four. It was pretty uplifting. They should have beaten Kentucky in the national semifinal and ended up losing in 5 sets. That was tough, but it was still certainly a successful postseason for a team that only lost 5 matches all year. Then came the transfer portal, and a little more aggressive, I would say, outgoing than I would have expected from a program that is very clearly capable of hanging with just about anybody. Now, obviously, they're going to lose some talent this year. They always do, and they're going to bring some talent in, which they have already begun to do. But you had a couple, I thought, pretty big contributors who are headed out. Certainly, their setter, the libero, will still be here next year, and then they got a pretty big fish in the transfer portal by bringing in Florida's Jada August. So that's already a big step forward. Give me the lay of the land as you see it, how this Badger volleyball team is navigating the portal and what they have then coming up for the next season.
Yeah, it kind of felt a little bit fast and furious. I get back from Kansas City and all of a sudden, I'm trying to remember which 2 were the first 2. Addie Horner was one of the first 2. I think it is Eddie Horner and Aya Warren were the 2 right off the bat that,
and those are understandable. They're playing behind kids that are the same age at the same spot.
Yeah, did not have a chance to get my mail yet by the time those came in after getting back into Madison. So, it kind of came fast and furious, but it's not really a surprise just given the calendar. The transfer portal window opens during postseason play. So if football, you're on, a Final Four team and you want to see if you can play somewhere, elsewhere where you're at, get more opportunities, you really have to make a decision fast. And I do feel for some of those players who are having to make a decision about their futures so quickly where, on Thursday night, you're in a 5th set against Kentucky with the spot in the national championship match on the line. And Friday night, you're writing your farewell Wisconsin Instagram post. So, it came fast. You mentioned Jayla from Florida. Obviously that's the most exciting transfer portal addition for Wisconsin. Somebody that, could potentially be in that, National Player of the Year conversation, depending on, how much she can kind of continue to take strides with Wisconsin staff. It certainly helps that John Shondell working with the middles here. So she really stands out. I'm really interested to see what Ava Travis does from UC Santa Barbara. I thought that was a really good addition. That helps a lot too with losing Una Vajagic. So, a lot to like there. With Isabel Hoppe, being able to flip her on, technically not a portal commit because she is class of 2026. But, what they've been able to do, it hasn't necessarily been massive numbers, but I do like what each of these three players give them. And, some of this is just the nature of how college sports is with the transfer portal. If you're Addie Horner and you're the setter behind Charlie Furbringer, Charlie showed just how good she is, yet again this year. Not that it was a surprise last year. She was a third-team All-American last year. Last year is in 2024, so I guess 2 seasons ago. Now this 2025 season is in the rearview mirror. But, she showed yet again just how good she is. And, okay, if you're Addie Horner, it's tough to be, behind Charlie. If you're Anaya Warren, it's tough to be behind Kristen Simon, who's in your same class and had a really impressive season. And, the thing that probably doesn't get talked enough about this Wisconsin postseason run, obviously Mimi Collier was, out of her mind, incredible with how well she played. How well Carter Booth, Allie Andrew did in the middle, excellent. What Una did, excellent. But also the way that Wisconsin passed was really impressive in terms of how, they were able to, pull off the upset against Texas and, have that 5-set match that I'm sure, there are certainly some things in there that Wisconsin would love to have back. The service errors in the second set. Certainly, that's something that quickly comes to mind for me however many weeks later. But, overall, a very successful season for Wisconsin volleyball. A lot for them to be proud of with a team that had lost a lot of pieces, that was relying on a lot of young players. I would say they got pretty much everything you could ask for out of that team. And, certainly now some reasons for optimism with what they've done so far in the offseason.
I wanted to touch real briefly on women's hockey at Wisconsin, having, of course, a great season, as they often do, number 1 team in the country. And we now know officially they got a whole bunch of Olympians going into these games next month. In Italy, you've got 4 players on the current roster who are going to be playing for Team USA. That's Layla Edwards, Caroline Harvey, Ava McNaughton, and Kirsten Sims. Sims had the big shot last year that won them the championship against Ohio State in pretty dramatic fashion. Caroline Harvey is probably the best player in the country and trending toward maybe being the number 1 overall pick in the Professional Women's Hockey League draft. So the unique thing here is that in the previous Olympic cycles, you've had, when players are up for the Olympic team, they don't play their hockey season in college. If they're a college player on the team, they just take that year off. And that's not what's happening this year. You've got players who are basically going to leave in February to go play in the Olympics and then come back. Maybe make an NCAA tournament run in March. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic. Going to be a lot of Wisconsin faces in the Olympics with, that women's hockey team is a primary example. You've got Hillary Knight, former Badger, Britta Curl, former Badger, who will also be on that team. You've got Jordan Stoles, the Kewaskum speed skater, who's going to be, might win 3 gold medals, might do something that hasn't been done since Eric Heiden back in 1980. So that's pretty impressive stuff as well. So a lot to look forward to and watch here, and the University of Wisconsin right in the middle of it. The men's hockey team, they also played here at Pfizer Forum in Milwaukee over between the holidays. They did not win the face-off event that's here every year. They did take second. They won their first game, lost their second. They're still number 2 in the country. Things are really looking up for them. I don't know if you guys want to add anything with hockey. I know that our guy Dave Coleman, I should bring him on the podcast because he'll have a lot to say as we get into the Olympics. We'll have a lot more to say going forward. But I didn't know, Mark or John, if you wanted to add anything that you know about these hockey teams before we get out of here.
Yeah. As far as the women go, they're going to be without, Wisconsin's going to be without 4 of their players for what those 2 weeks of tournament play in the Olympics. I think it's February 5th through the 19th. And then there's obviously going to be some training camp stuff that they're going to miss as well. But, Wisconsin's stacked. I mean, you talk about who made the Olympic team. Lacey Eaton, who's a senior, was a player that I thought was going to have a chance to be on the Olympic team, and she didn't make the cut. So, so she's going to be there. You got Cassie Hall, who's a great scorer. She's going to be, she'll still be with the team. So, I think there are a lot of players that are still going to be there. I mean, sure, you're going to miss your 4 top players, but I think this is going to be one of those times where maybe you start to see like, well, how good this team is. Because I mean, pound for pound, I know Wisconsin women's hockey doesn't get the traction of men's basketball or football, but pound for pound, that's probably the most talented and accomplished group of players on a team that Wisconsin has. I mean, that's a pretty talented group when you look at some of their resume. So so yeah, I mean, I'm interested, obviously, to see how those Wisconsin players do in the Olympics. And Caroline Harvey is fantastic, and if you haven't seen her play, you need to. But for the Wisconsin team, I think this is just going to be a great opportunity for other players. You got, when you have really talented players like that, you have players who are itching to say like, hey, okay, they're going, okay, good. Now it's my turn. Now I get a chance to show what I can do. And I think we're going to see some of that, from Wisconsin during that month or so that those players are gone.
Yeah, I think it's, really helpful to have that. It kind of reminds me a little bit in terms of with volleyball, how Wisconsin went without Charlie Furbringer. There are 2 different situations, certainly not an apples to apples comparison, but I think it is an interesting chance to kind of see what in, a game setting, against other, Big Ten schools, you can, see what, they can do against, obviously not all Big Ten, but, what they can do against some of these better schools, kind of toward the end of the season. And, to then, have those players come back with the Olympic experience, obviously a big win there.
Any last thoughts from either one of you guys? It can be back to football. It can be basketball. Mark, I didn't ask you about the men's basketball team. If you have any thoughts, I know you pay attention, not necessarily as closely as John does, but I know you're following it for sure. Anything else rattling around in your brains before I let you guys go? Mark?
Yeah. Well, 2 things. One, talking about the basketball team, I guess the one thing that if you're a fan of the Badgers that I would give you hope is that, when you're talking about their struggles, it's not like you're talking about, that they can't shoot or they can't score, although John Blackwell's going through, some, a slump right now. I mean, I think defense is an area that a team can really improve at. And it's one of those areas where it's not about the skill of shooting or dribbling. It's more about, being in the right spot and knowing your assignments. So I think Wisconsin has a chance to get better in that way. And maybe as the season comes toward an end or late in the season, maybe start picking up some of those wins that they need that are going to get them to the tournament. I had this same thought about Wisconsin football, so hopefully it doesn't come back to bite me. But I just have this, it's hard for me to not picture Wisconsin basketball making the tournament. It's hard for me to picture them struggling, that much. So I'll say that. And then the other thing, transfer portal wise, I'm interested to see what they do in the defensive line. That's a key area that they need to look at. And they, so far as of Monday afternoon, unless something's happened since we've been on this podcast, that's an area that they have not added anyone yet. So that would be one position in football that I'm interested to see what they do.
To answer our earlier question, to confirm, there is no Preston Zachman Wisconsin reunion on the schedule. Wisconsin avoided Indiana. They avoided a lot of the higher power Big Ten schools. So
yeah, I mean, that's the thing. They could be good next year with that schedule. It is the opposite of what they had this past year, where they were always going to be up against it. But like next year, they could actually make some hay without even being markedly better.
Yeah, it felt like this year Wisconsin could have been better than they were the previous season with a worse record potentially. Not saying that they were better. I think there were a lot of issues with this 2025 team. But yeah, this group does have some things going for them with the schedule, with everything where, if it doesn't click in 2026, you kind of do wonder what does. But in the short term with basketball, it'll be interesting. The Big Ten is very tough this year. I don't think necessarily people are expecting a weak year from the Big Ten, but I've been impressed with the quality of basketball across the conference. So on one hand, that's a lot of opportunities. On the other hand, that's a lot of challenges. And, the nice thing with this schedule is, okay, it is kind of a tough on-ramp back to Big Ten play where, okay, you have to play Purdue. UCLA did not have a good start against Iowa. But even then, UCLA is not necessarily a pushover, as evident with how, they came back in that game in Iowa City. And then you go to Michigan. That's a really tough on-ramp. But then things do get a little easier, with Minnesota, with Rutgers, with Penn State. So, there could be some ups and downs. This could be a little bit of a roller coaster here. And, and then a lot of road games in February. So I'll be curious to see, okay, can Wisconsin, fix these inconsistencies? It's certainly tough when, we've been seeing a lot of these issues now, in 5 games with, 5 not so competitive final results. But, Greg Gard was saying earlier, in November that he doesn't want his team to be playing its best basketball in November because, there's room for growth. And I think we'll see in these next 2 months just how much growth there is for a team that obviously had a lot of new pieces, 8 new players. So it'll be a fun next 2 months to watch for sure.
One final shout out. It's not University of Wisconsin, but it's adjacent. Wisconsin athletics in the state of Wisconsin, UW River Falls football team winning the NCAA Division III National Championship on Sunday. An absolute crazy rags to riches story. That is the doormat of WIAC football for years and years, for 2 decades. And they built themselves up to winning a national championship in the Stag Bowl. They upset North Central of Illinois and Naperville. They had appeared in the last, I think it was the last 5 straight Stag Bowls and had won a couple of them. So that was a shocking development for River Falls, this high octane offense that they built. The WIAC, of course, always up for some national titles. You had the UW Lacrosse won men's cross country, and UW Oshkosh won women's volleyball here in the fall. But that football thing is really, really special. Had a lot of fun putting something together at jsonline.com, following that team a little bit. Caleb Blaha, Minnesota native, Gagliardi Trophy winner. That's the D3 Heisman. He had an incredible final game, an incredible season for River Falls. That is going to do it here on Terrace View, our Wisconsin Badgers podcast. Thank you to my colleagues, John Steppe and Mark Stewart, for joining me on this little journey that we went on. We'll do this again very soon. Lots to talk about in the weeks ahead. Thanks, guys. I'll talk to you again next week.
All right.